The cruelest thing about being invisible is that the person you would have given your whole life for never realizes you were standing beside them until the day you're gone. The grand hall of Blackwood Palace shimmered beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers, their golden light dancing across polished marble floors and silver banners embroidered with the crest of the northern wolves. Music floated through the air as nobles laughed over sparkling glasses, servants hurried silently between endless tables, and every conversation revolved around one man. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stood at the center of it all, calm, commanding, every movement effortless, every smile enough to make the room lean a little closer. Tonight marked another year of peace under his reign, another victory celebrated by every pack across the kingdom. They praised his wisdom. They praised his courage. They praised the prosperity that had transformed forgotten villages into thriving towns. They praised the king. No one praised the Omega who quietly made sure none of this celebration ever unraveled. Evelyn Carter adjusted a silver ribbon around one of the ceremonial banners before stepping back to inspect it. It hung perfectly straight, just as it always did. She noticed a candle burning too low near the eastern column and replaced it before anyone else saw the wax dripping onto the marble. A nervous young servant nearly dropped an expensive tray, and Evelyn caught it with both hands before a single crystal glass shattered. She smiled softly, whispered that everything was fine, and disappeared before the grateful servant even had the chance to thank her. That was how the last 9 years had passed. Small moments, quiet corrections, invisible kindness. Every celebration that appeared flawless carried fingerprints no one could see. Evelyn preferred it that way, or at least she had convinced herself that she did. 9 years earlier, she had entered Blackwood Palace carrying nothing except a worn travel bag, a recommendation from an elderly healer, and a heart far too willing to believe that devotion alone could become destiny. She had been barely 19 then, uncertain, hopeful, fascinated by stories of the young Alpha King who had united rival packs without losing his compassion. She had imagined that serving such a leader would give her life purpose. She had never imagined that purpose would slowly become love. Not loud love, not reckless love, the kind that asked for nothing. The kind that remembered how he preferred his tea after long council meetings. The kind that noticed when exhaustion settled behind his silver eyes before anyone else did. The kind that quietly left fresh maps on his desk before sunrise because she knew another journey awaited him. The kind that stayed awake through stormy nights, making certain every lantern in the palace remained lit because Adrian often worked until dawn without realizing darkness had surrounded him. She had never asked him to notice. At first, but years have a way of changing silent promises into silent heartbreak. Across the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted. Adrian had finished another speech, thanking the allied packs for their loyalty and promising an even brighter future. His deep voice carried warmth that made strangers feel important. Evelyn smiled despite herself. He always meant every word he spoke. That had never been the problem. The problem was that he saw kingdoms before individuals, victories before sacrifices, responsibilities before hearts. He thanked generals, advisors, diplomats, even the musicians filling the hall with elegant melodies. When his gaze drifted across the room, it passed directly over Evelyn without stopping, not because he intended to ignore her, simply because he had grown so accustomed to her presence that his mind treated it like breathing. Constant, reliable, unquestioned, invisible. Miss Carter, a young kitchen assistant, whispered nervously as she approached. The royal baker says the anniversary cake arrived with damaged decorations. Evelyn looked toward the enormous dessert waiting beyond the ballroom doors. A section of delicate sugar flowers had collapsed during transport. She smiled gently. We still have 20 minutes. We can fix it. But everyone said it was impossible. Almost nothing is impossible if we stay calm. Together, they worked quietly in the service corridor while laughter echoed through the palace. Evelyn reshaped each flower with patient hands until the cake looked untouched by the accident. When the baker finally saw it, relief flooded his face. You saved tonight, he breathed. Evelyn simply nodded. Just make sure the king enjoys it. She never said, I hope he smiles. She never needed to. She already knew she would treasure that smile whether it belonged to her or not. As the celebration continued, guests admired flawless decorations, perfect timing, warm food, polished silver, and effortless elegance. They believed perfection simply happened inside a royal palace. None of them noticed the woman quietly carrying a small notebook where every detail had been planned weeks in advance. Every guest preference, every seating adjustment, every allergy, every weather backup, every forgotten birthday, every lonely servant who needed encouragement, every burden Adrian never had to carry because Evelyn had already carried it first. Near midnight, she slipped away from the ballroom and climbed the narrow staircase leading to the western balcony. The summer breeze carried the scent of pine through the cool mountain air. Below, music drifted upward like distant memories. She rested both hands on the stone railing and closed her eyes. 9 years, she whispered to herself. The words felt heavier than she expected. 9 years of choosing him every single morning without ever asking whether he would choose her even once. Behind her, the balcony doors opened. Evelyn turned instinctively, hope rising before reason could stop it. Adrian stepped outside with several council members discussing trade routes for the coming winter. They walked directly past her. One advisor asked a question. Adrian answered thoughtfully without ever looking in her direction. A few seconds later, they disappeared back inside. The balcony fell silent once more. Evelyn remained standing exactly where she was, staring at the closed doors while the breeze lifted a loose strand of her chestnut hair. For the first time in nearly a decade, she realized something painfully simple. She had spent 9 years waiting for one moment that had never actually been promised. And somewhere deep inside her heart, so quietly that even she almost failed to hear it, another voice finally answered. Then stop waiting. Morning arrived with the quiet dignity that only mountain kingdoms seemed to possess. Soft sunlight spilled across the towers of Blackwood Palace, painting the gray stone with warm shades of gold, while servants began another day long before most nobles opened their eyes. Evelyn Carter had already been awake for more than 2 hours. She walked through the palace gardens carrying a small leather notebook, pausing occasionally to jot down reminders before moving to the next task. The eastern fountain needed repairs before the autumn festival. The greenhouse required additional herbs for the royal physicians. 3 young servants deserved commendation after working through the previous night's celebration without complaint. None of these responsibilities officially belonged to her. Somehow they always became hers anyway. She did not resent the work. She only wondered when she had stopped noticing how heavy it had become. Inside the palace kitchens, familiar voices greeted her with relieved smiles. "Miss Carter, thank goodness you are here," one cook called while another hurried toward her carrying 2 inventory sheets. The grain shipment arrived early, and the merchant accidentally switched 2 orders. Evelyn accepted the papers, studied them for less than a minute, and calmly explained exactly which wagons belonged where. The worried expressions around the room immediately softened. "How do you always know what to do?" the youngest baker asked with genuine admiration. Evelyn laughed quietly. "I do not always know. I simply listen before I decide." That answer sounded simple, but everyone inside the palace knew the truth. Whenever confusion appeared, Evelyn somehow restored order without raising her voice. Whenever disagreements grew tense, she reminded people that kindness solved more problems than pride. She remembered birthdays that families forgot. She noticed when a stable hand limped after working too many hours. She quietly replaced worn blankets before winter arrived because she knew which servants would never ask for new ones themselves. She had become the heartbeat beneath the palace floor, steady enough that no one noticed it until imagining life without it became impossible. Yet even hearts could grow tired. Late that morning, Evelyn crossed the central courtyard just as royal guards assembled for inspection. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stood before them wearing a dark ceremonial coat embroidered with silver thread. Confidence seemed as natural to him as breathing. His words carried easily across the courtyard, praising discipline, fairness, and service before dismissing the gathering with a respectful nod. Several officers remained behind, eager to speak with him. Noble families waited nearby, hoping for a few moments of conversation. Children visiting from allied territories smiled excitedly when Adrian stopped to greet them. Evelyn watched from the edge of the courtyard with the same quiet admiration she had carried for years. She loved seeing the leader everyone else saw. Strong, patient, dependable. The kingdom truly flourished because of him. That was exactly why admitting the truth hurt so much. A wonderful king could still fail to see one lonely heart standing only a few steps away. Adrian accepted reports from his advisors before turning toward the palace entrance. For a brief second, his eyes drifted across the courtyard. Evelyn instinctively straightened the stack of documents in her arms. Perhaps today, perhaps after 9 years, there would finally be a pause, a greeting, a question asking whether she had slept well after organizing the celebration. Instead, Adrian smiled politely at an elderly gardener standing behind her. "The roses looked beautiful last night," he said warmly. "Thank you for taking such good care of them." The gardener beamed with pride. Evelyn smiled as well because the compliment was deserved. She simply lowered her eyes before anyone noticed the quiet disappointment crossing her face. It was remarkable how the human heart could break without making a sound. As the afternoon unfolded, palace life continued exactly as it always had. Advisors requested Evelyn's help locating forgotten records. Young servants asked her opinion before making difficult decisions. Even members of the royal council occasionally depended upon information that only she seemed able to remember. One councilman laughed while signing several documents. "If Miss Carter ever leaves this palace, we would all be hopeless." Everyone chuckled. Evelyn did too. The words lingered with her long after the laughter faded. They spoke of her importance the way people admired the weather when it cooperated. Useful, convenient, reliable, never irreplaceable. Later that day, she entered the royal library carrying several reports that Adrian would need before the evening council session. She placed them neatly on his desk exactly where he preferred to find them. Nearby sat an old wooden box containing dozens of neatly tied ribbons. She recognized every color immediately. Blue marked military correspondence. Green represented village restoration projects. White contained letters from orphanages and schools receiving royal support. Each bundle had been organized by her hands over countless evenings after everyone else had gone home. Adrian entered moments later, speaking with his chief advisor about border agreements. Evelyn stepped aside to give them space. Adrian stopped near the desk, immediately noticing the perfectly arranged reports. "Excellent," he said absent-mindedly while opening the first folder. "I was hoping these would already be prepared." He never asked who had prepared them. He never needed to. Somehow they were simply always there. Evelyn quietly excused herself before either man realized she had even entered the room. Outside the library windows, gentle rain began falling across the palace grounds. She wandered through the covered walkways until she reached a small glass conservatory filled with flowers from every allied territory. Years earlier, Adrian had once mentioned that fresh blossoms made long meetings feel less exhausting. He had forgotten saying it within minutes. Evelyn had remembered it for 9 years. Every week, she personally selected new arrangements for his office. Every season, she learned which flowers bloomed longest and which scents helped calm anxious visitors before difficult negotiations. She touched the petals of a white lily and smiled sadly. Love, she realized, had quietly transformed into habit. Habit had transformed into identity. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten who Evelyn Carter was outside the walls of Blackwood Palace. The realization did not arrive like thunder. It settled gently into her heart, like the evening rain upon the conservatory roof. For the first time since she had walked through the palace gates as a hopeful 19-year-old Omega, she asked herself a question she had never dared to consider before. If she disappeared tomorrow, would anyone miss Evelyn herself? Or would they only miss everything she quietly did for them every single day? The following morning arrived wrapped in a quiet mist that softened the distant mountains surrounding Blackwood Palace. The world seemed gentler than the thoughts inside Evelyn Carter's heart. She followed her familiar routine with the same steady grace she had practiced for nearly a decade, reviewing supply ledgers before sunrise, checking on the palace infirmary, greeting sleepy servants with warm smiles, and making certain every detail of the kingdom continued moving as smoothly as the gears inside a carefully crafted clock. Nothing about the palace appeared different. That was the strange part. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet something inside her had begun changing in ways she could no longer ignore. Every hallway carried memories. Every staircase reminded her of countless mornings rushing to prepare for council meetings. Every window overlooked gardens she had helped restore after harsh winters. She had quietly poured pieces of herself into every corner of Blackwood Palace until the place almost felt like an extension of her own soul. Yet she could not remember the last time anyone had asked a simple question about her happiness. Around mid-morning, word spread that representatives from 3 neighboring packs had arrived unexpectedly. The palace instantly transformed into its usual rhythm of organized urgency. Advisors hurried between meeting rooms. Guards adjusted security schedules. Kitchen staff expanded the afternoon banquet. As always, everyone instinctively looked toward Evelyn whenever uncertainty appeared. She calmly reassigned servants, reorganized guest accommodations, and solved a dozen small problems before anyone else even realized they existed. Watching everything settle into place brought her no satisfaction this time. Instead, it left behind an unfamiliar emptiness. She was beginning to understand that being needed was not the same as being cherished. As preparations continued, an elegant carriage rolled through the palace gates. A graceful young woman stepped onto the stone courtyard wearing a deep sapphire gown that shimmered beneath the morning light. Her name was Victoria Ashford, daughter of one of the most respected alpha families in the Northern Territories. Rumors had followed her for weeks. Intelligent, compassionate, refined. Many believed she possessed every quality expected of a future queen. Palace servants whispered excitedly while nobles exchanged knowing smiles. Evelyn heard only fragments of their conversations as she carried documents across the courtyard. She and the king would make a remarkable pair. Their alliance would strengthen every northern pack. The council has wanted this for years. None of those words surprised Evelyn. In truth, she had expected this day long before it finally arrived. Adrian deserved someone who could stand proudly beside him beneath the royal banners, someone the kingdom would immediately recognize as its queen. She had always known she was never that woman. Knowing it, however, did not lessen the ache settling quietly inside her chest. From the palace balcony, she watched Adrian greet Victoria with genuine warmth. He welcomed her personally instead of sending an advisor. They laughed together while walking toward the great hall, discussing matters of diplomacy with an ease that came naturally to 2 leaders raised within noble traditions. Evelyn smiled to herself. They looked appropriate together. Perfect, even. She whispered the thought only once because hearing it aloud somehow made it more real. Throughout the afternoon, she crossed paths with Adrian several times while coordinating the visiting delegation. Each encounter lasted only seconds. He thanked her politely for organizing the guest chambers. He complimented the efficiency of the banquet schedule. He asked whether the council records had been updated. Every sentence concerned the kingdom. Every conversation ended before it truly began. It occurred to Evelyn that she could remember hundreds of details about Adrian's favorite books, his habit of skipping breakfast during stressful weeks, the way he unconsciously tapped one finger against his chair whenever he worried about distant villages, and the quiet smile he reserved for children. Yet after 9 years, she wondered whether Adrian knew anything equally personal about her. Did he know she loved the first snowfall every winter? Did he know she secretly collected pressed wildflowers inside old journals? Did he know her birthday had quietly passed 3 weeks earlier without celebration? She already knew the answers. Late that afternoon, she found herself alone in the palace archives searching for an old treaty requested by the council. Shelves stretched toward the ceiling, filled with countless volumes preserving the history of generations. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, filling the room with peaceful silence. Adrian entered unexpectedly a few minutes later. He appeared tired, rubbing one hand across his forehead before noticing Evelyn standing near the western shelves. "There you are," he said with visible relief. "I was told only you would know where the Silver Creek Agreement is stored." Evelyn located the document almost immediately and placed it into his hands. Adrian smiled appreciatively. "I knew I could count on you." Those simple words should have comforted her. Instead, they settled heavily upon her heart. Count on you. Not I miss seeing you. Not how have you been. Not have you rested after everything you did for the anniversary celebration. Only certainty that she would always be there exactly when needed. Adrian began reviewing the treaty before speaking again. "Victoria has offered several promising ideas for future cooperation between our territories. The council is impressed. I believe this partnership may shape the kingdom for many years." Evelyn looked at him quietly. There was genuine hope in his eyes. She was happy for him. She truly was. Yet she suddenly understood something painful. She had spent years dreaming about conversations that existed only inside her imagination, while Adrian had simply continued living his life, never realizing another heart quietly built its entire world around him. "That is wonderful, Your Majesty," she answered softly. Adrian smiled, already turning another page. "I knew you would understand." Moments later, he thanked her once again before leaving the archive with the treaty tucked beneath one arm. The heavy wooden door closed behind him, and silence returned. Evelyn remained standing exactly where she was, staring at the empty doorway until the fading footsteps disappeared completely. Then, for the first time in 9 years, she allowed herself to stop pretending. A single quiet tear slipped down her cheek before she gently wiped it away with the back of her hand. She was not crying because Adrian had been cruel. He had never been cruel. He had simply never seen the love standing faithfully beside him every single day. And perhaps the saddest realization of all was that he could not lose something he had never known he possessed. The palace bells rang softly before sunrise, their familiar melody drifting through corridors that had become as familiar to Evelyn Carter as her own heartbeat. She woke before the first servant lit the hallway lanterns, not because anyone expected it anymore, but because after 9 years her body no longer knew any other rhythm. She folded the blanket on her small bed, opened the window overlooking the eastern gardens, and watched the first rays of sunlight spill across Blackwood Palace. For a long moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the cool mountain air. Then, with surprising calm, she whispered, "Thank you for giving me a place to grow." They were not words spoken with bitterness. They were words of farewell. Her room had always been modest compared to the grand chambers occupied by nobles and royal advisors. A wooden bookshelf, a writing desk polished by years of careful use, a pressed flower resting inside an old journal, and a small chest containing everything she truly owned. It took less than 30 minutes to pack her belongings. 9 years of loving someone had somehow required very little space. Before closing the chest, she paused over a neatly folded blue scarf. Adrian had once left it behind after returning from a winter inspection nearly 7 years earlier. A servant had forgotten to return it, and Evelyn had quietly kept it safe ever since, believing one day she might hand it back herself. Her fingers rested against the soft fabric before she gently placed it on the desk instead. It belonged to its rightful owner now. She reached for a fresh sheet of parchment and dipped her pen into dark ink. The words came slowly, each sentence carrying years of quiet gratitude rather than regret. "Your Majesty, thank you for allowing me to serve this kingdom. These years have shaped me into someone stronger than the frightened Omega who first arrived at your gates. The palace no longer needs someone who quietly stands behind every celebration. It deserves people who choose to remain because their hearts are still full. Mine is asking me to discover who I am beyond these walls. Please do not search for reasons. There are none that require blame. I simply believe it is time for another chapter. May the kingdom continue to flourish beneath your wisdom. With gratitude, Evelyn Carter." She read the letter only once before folding it carefully and placing it atop the blue scarf. There was no confession hidden between the lines. No mention of love. No attempt to make Adrian feel guilty. Love that demanded repayment had never been the love she carried. As the palace slowly awakened, Evelyn followed one final routine. She visited the kitchens and quietly left updated inventory notes where the head cook would find them. She stopped by the infirmary to organize fresh medical supplies for the coming week. She placed a new bundle of herbs beside the elderly gardener who often forgot to replace them before tending the roses. Every task felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, she was doing these things without expecting tomorrow to arrive exactly the same. Several servants smiled warmly as she passed. "Good morning, Miss Carter." "Good morning. Will you be attending the council luncheon later?" She answered each greeting with her usual kindness, never allowing anyone to suspect that these ordinary moments were becoming precious memories. Near the main corridor, she encountered Victoria Ashford studying a large painting of the kingdom. The noblewoman turned with a welcoming smile. "Miss Carter, everyone has told me how invaluable you have been to this palace. I finally understand why. I have never seen a royal household run with such grace." Evelyn thanked her sincerely. There was no jealousy in her heart. Victoria was intelligent, thoughtful, and genuinely cared about the people around her. If Adrian ever chose someone like her, The kingdom would be fortunate. I hope Blackwood Palace always feels like home to you, Victoria said kindly before continuing toward the council chambers. Evelyn watched her disappear around the corner. Then she smiled softly to herself. Home. Perhaps that word had quietly changed its meaning. Just before noon, she walked toward Adrian's private office carrying several completed reports, exactly as she had done countless times before. The royal secretary accepted the documents with relief. Perfect timing, Miss Carter. His Majesty is already inside discussing tomorrow's diplomatic schedule. Evelyn nodded. Please place these on his desk after the meeting. The secretary hesitated. Would you like me to tell him you stopped by? Evelyn looked toward the closed office doors. She imagined interrupting the meeting. Imagined one final conversation. Imagined asking him to remember her. The thought faded almost as quickly as it arrived. No, she answered gently. There is no need. She turned away before anyone could notice the quiet resolve in her eyes. One final destination remained. The western balcony overlooked the forest stretching beyond the palace walls. It was the same place where she had realized her waiting had finally come to an end. The breeze lifted her chestnut hair exactly as it had only days before. She rested one hand against the cool stone railing and looked toward the winding road disappearing into the distant mountains. Somewhere beyond those trees existed villages she had never visited, children she had never met, mornings that belonged entirely to her instead of royal schedules. The future no longer frightened her. It invited her. When the afternoon sun reached its highest point, Evelyn carried her small chest through the servants' entrance instead of the grand palace gates. She thanked the elderly gatekeeper for his years of kindness. He smiled warmly and wished her safe travels, assuming she was leaving on another short assignment for the palace. No one stopped her. No one questioned the single travel bag resting upon her shoulder. No one hurried through the courtyard calling her name. Blackwood Palace continued breathing with its familiar rhythm as though nothing had changed at all. Evelyn stepped onto the stone road leading away from the kingdom she had quietly served for 9 years. She did not look back immediately. She waited until the palace had become smaller against the mountain skyline. Only then did she turn one final time. Sunlight reflected from the highest tower, filling the afternoon sky with golden light. She smiled through glistening eyes, whispered a heartfelt goodbye that only the wind could hear, and continued walking toward a life where, for the first time in nearly a decade, every step belonged completely to her. The first morning after Evelyn Carter left Blackwood Palace began like every other morning the kingdom had known for years, at least for the first few minutes. The palace bells rang at sunrise. Servants opened the great windows to welcome the crisp mountain air. Royal guards changed shifts with practiced precision. In the kitchens, breakfast preparations filled the halls with the comforting scent of fresh bread and warm herbs. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until the smallest details began slipping quietly out of place. A shipment of fresh produce arrived at the wrong entrance because no one had remembered to update the seasonal delivery route. The head cook searched frantically for the weekly menu that was normally waiting on his desk before dawn. 2 visiting delegates were accidentally assigned to identical guest suites, forcing embarrassed attendants to rush through the corridors searching for empty rooms. None of the mistakes were disastrous. They were simply unusual. Throughout the morning, people found themselves saying the same words over and over again. Miss Carter usually handles this. The palace librarian frowned at a stack of unsigned requests waiting on his desk. Has anyone seen Miss Carter? A stable hand searched 3 different storage rooms before realizing the winter horse blankets had never been labeled for early distribution. She always prepared these weeks in advance. The royal physician discovered that several herbal supplies had been carefully organized, enough to last nearly a month, along with handwritten notes explaining exactly when replacements should be ordered. He smiled sadly as he recognized the familiar handwriting. Even after leaving, Evelyn had quietly planned for everyone else's future before thinking about her own. By late morning, the rhythm of the palace had noticeably changed. Nothing had collapsed, but nothing flowed as effortlessly as before. Conversations became longer because people searched for answers Evelyn would have provided immediately. Meetings started 10 minutes late because documents had been filed under unfamiliar systems after her departure. Young servants looked uncertain without the calm smile that usually reassured them whenever unexpected problems appeared. It was as though an invisible thread holding hundreds of tiny pieces together had suddenly disappeared. Inside the royal council chamber, Adrian Blackwood listened patiently as advisors debated trade agreements with neighboring territories. Normally, every report appeared exactly where he expected it, carefully arranged according to priority. Today, several folders were missing while others arrived out of order. Adrian paused midway through the meeting. "Where's the river commerce report?" Silence settled over the room. One advisor cleared his throat awkwardly. "We are still trying to locate it, Your Majesty." Adrian frowned slightly. It is always prepared before council begins. The room remained quiet until the elderly royal secretary spoke carefully. "Miss Carter usually organized those reports." Adrian nodded almost absent-mindedly. "Then ask her to bring it when she has a moment." The secretary hesitated, lowering his eyes. "Your Majesty, Miss Carter is no longer at the palace." Adrian looked up from the documents in front of him. "She is away on official business?" "No, Your Majesty." Another uncomfortable silence followed. "She resigned yesterday." Adrian blinked once, almost expecting someone to correct the statement. "Resign?" The word sounded strangely unfamiliar. "Yes, Your Majesty. She left a letter in your office." Adrian remained still for several seconds before quietly responding. "I must have overlooked it." The meeting continued, but his concentration wandered in subtle ways he could not explain. Several times he instinctively reached for information that never appeared. Once he almost called Evelyn's name before remembering the secretary's words. She resigned. The sentence refused to settle comfortably inside his thoughts. After the council adjourned, Adrian returned to his private office. The room felt exactly as it always had. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. Fresh flowers rested in their usual place. His desk remained perfectly organized. Only then did he notice something unusual. A folded blue scarf lay neatly beside a sealed envelope bearing his name. He recognized the scarf immediately. He had forgotten it years ago after returning from a winter inspection. He had assumed it had simply disappeared. Slowly, he picked up the letter and broke the seal. As his eyes moved across the page, the room grew remarkably quiet. There were no accusations, no complaints, no hidden bitterness, only gratitude. Gratitude for 9 years of service. Gratitude for opportunities to grow. Gratitude for a kingdom she sincerely hoped would continue flourishing. Adrian finished reading twice before carefully folding the letter again. His gaze drifted toward the window overlooking the western forests. Something felt unexpectedly unsettled inside him. It was not heartbreak. Not yet. It was closer to confusion, the strange realization that someone who had always existed at the edge of every ordinary day had suddenly vanished without warning. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Victoria Ashford stepped inside, carrying several diplomatic proposals. She noticed the unusual expression crossing Adrian's face. "Is everything all right?" she asked kindly. Adrian looked toward the letter resting in his hand. "Miss Carter has left the palace." Victoria's warm smile faded. "She left? Permanently?" He nodded slowly. "Apparently yesterday." Victoria seemed genuinely surprised. "I met her only once, but she struck me as someone deeply devoted to this place." Adrian glanced around his office. The reports were arranged exactly as he preferred. Fresh flowers brightened the room. Even the ink bottles had been refilled before running empty. He had never questioned why everything always appeared at precisely the right moment. For the first time, he wondered how many quiet acts of care had filled his days without ever asking for recognition. That evening, as the palace settled beneath another peaceful sunset, Adrian found himself standing alone on the western balcony overlooking the winding road disappearing into the mountains. The breeze carried the scent of pine across the valley. Something about the view felt strangely different, though he could not explain why. After several silent minutes, he spoke almost to himself. "Where did you go, Evelyn?" The following days unfolded with a quiet uneasiness that no celebration, no successful council meeting, and no polished royal speech could completely erase. Adrian Blackwood continued fulfilling every responsibility expected of an alpha king, yet he found himself pausing in moments that had once passed unnoticed. Each pause seemed to carry the shape of someone who was no longer there. During breakfast, his favorite tea tasted slightly different. He asked the kitchen steward whether the leaves had changed. The steward shook his head with an embarrassed smile. "No, Your Majesty. Miss Carter always blended a small amount of mountain mint into your tea after difficult council weeks." None of us knew she was doing it until we searched her notes. Adrian looked down into the steaming cup. For 9 years he had believed he simply preferred the palace tea. He had never realized someone had quietly remembered what brought him comfort. Later that afternoon, he noticed fresh flowers had not been placed inside the council chamber. A servant rushed to apologize, explaining that no one knew which arrangements belonged in which room, because only Evelyn had memorized the seasonal rotation for every gathering space. Adrian surprised himself by answering gently, "It is all right." But as he entered the meeting, the room somehow felt colder without the familiar fragrance he had unconsciously associated with calm discussions. Small discoveries continued appearing everywhere. The royal tailor revealed that Evelyn always repaired Adrian's ceremonial cloaks before anyone noticed loose stitching. The stable master admitted she personally checked every travel route before the king left the palace, quietly asking villagers about damaged bridges or flooded roads so his journeys would remain safe and efficient. The palace librarian smiled wistfully while explaining that she had restored dozens of worn books because she remembered which stories Adrian reread during long winters. None of these acts had been part of her official responsibilities. She had simply noticed what others overlooked. One rainy evening, Adrian remained inside his office long after everyone else had retired. The palace felt unusually silent. His eyes wandered toward a small cabinet tucked beneath the western bookshelf. He had rarely opened it because Evelyn always handled old correspondence and archived reports. Curious, he unlocked the cabinet and discovered several neatly labeled wooden boxes arranged with her familiar precision. The first contained records of village restoration projects dating back nearly a decade. Every page included careful notes written in Evelyn's graceful handwriting. She had tracked which farming families needed additional seeds after poor harvests, which schools required winter firewood, and which orphanages quietly received anonymous donations from unused palace funds after she found legal ways to redirect forgotten budgets. Adrian frowned in astonishment. Many of those successful relief efforts had been praised as examples of thoughtful royal administration. Until this moment, he had honestly believed the ideas had originated from council discussions. Another box held personal reminders rather than official records. Replace the lavender near the Queen Mother's memorial before the first frost. Remember that Captain Ellis worries before every inspection but hides it from younger guards. Send blankets to Pine Hollow before the first snowfall because the children never complain even when they are cold. Ask the palace musicians to play softer melodies after veterans return from long patrols because loud celebrations sometimes overwhelm them. Adrian slowly lowered the page. None of these notes focused on efficiency. They focused on people. He continued searching until he reached a smaller cedar box wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. Inside rested dozens of tiny keepsakes that seemed almost insignificant until he examined them more closely. A pressed white lily from the conservatory. A faded festival ribbon from years earlier. A cracked fountain pen he vaguely remembered losing during an exhausting budget meeting. Beside each object lay a small handwritten card describing where it had come from and why she had preserved it. Adrian picked up the old pen and suddenly remembered that afternoon. He had been frustrated after receiving news of severe flooding in the eastern valleys. He had carelessly discarded the damaged pen and continued working without another thought. Evelyn had quietly retrieved it, not because it held value, but because it had belonged to him. Resting beneath the keepsakes was a leather journal unlike the official notebooks she carried throughout the palace. Adrian hesitated before opening it. The first page contained no secrets, only a simple sentence. If kindness is remembered by no one except the person who gives it, then it is still worth giving. He turned another page. The entries were never dramatic. They described ordinary days. The king smiled after hearing children sing in the courtyard today. I am glad the meeting ended peacefully. He looked exhausted after returning from the northern border, so I asked the kitchen to prepare his favorite soup. I hope he sleeps well tonight. Another page followed. He thanked every soldier personally after the spring inspection. I wish he remembered to thank himself sometimes. Another. He laughed today. I think the whole palace felt brighter because of it. Adrian stopped reading and closed his eyes. There was not a single confession asking for love. Not one sentence demanding recognition. Every page celebrated his happiness more than her own. The realization settled over him with unexpected weight. She had never been waiting for grand gestures. She had simply hoped to be seen. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. The elderly royal secretary stepped inside, carrying additional correspondence. His gaze drifted toward the open journal before resting on Adrian's expression. "Your Majesty," he said gently, "may I tell you something I have regretted keeping to myself?" Adrian nodded without looking up. 9 years ago, when Miss Carter first arrived, many people questioned whether an Omega belonged inside the royal administration. She never argued with them. She simply worked harder than everyone else. Over the years, I watched countless people receive praise for ideas that began with her. She never corrected them. I once asked her why. The secretary smiled sadly. She told me that if the kingdom prospered, it did not matter whose name received the applause. Adrian looked down at the journal resting in his hands. The palace around him suddenly felt impossibly large. For the first time since becoming king, he understood that the greatest gift he had ever been given had never asked to be noticed. And because it never demanded attention, he had allowed himself to believe it would always be there. The sunrise that greeted Adrian Blackwood 3 mornings later looked exactly like every other sunrise he had witnessed from the highest tower of Blackwood Palace, yet nothing inside him felt familiar anymore. The mountains still glowed beneath ribbons of golden light. The forest still stretched endlessly beyond the kingdom. The palace still awakened with disciplined precision. But now every beautiful view carried the quiet absence of someone he had never truly learned to see. He had spent 3 sleepless nights reading Evelyn Carter's journals, studying her careful notes, and discovering countless acts of kindness hidden behind ordinary days. Every page stripped away another layer of certainty he had once carried about himself. He had believed he understood every corner of his kingdom. Instead, he realized the person who understood it best had walked away without asking for a single reward. During breakfast, he barely touched the food before pushing the plate aside. The royal secretary noticed immediately. "Your Majesty, shall I postpone this morning's audience?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "No. Postpone tomorrow's council instead." The secretary blinked with surprise. "Tomorrow's council?" Adrian stood and looked toward the eastern gates beyond the palace courtyard. "I am leaving the palace today." The secretary hesitated. "For an inspection?" Adrian answered after a long silence. "No, for someone." News of the unexpected journey spread quietly through the palace. Advisors assumed the king had received urgent reports from a distant territory. Guards prepared horses without asking unnecessary questions. Only Victoria Ashford seemed to understand that something far more personal had changed. She found Adrian adjusting the saddle on his horse with his own hands rather than allowing attendants to do it for him. "You are searching for Miss Carter," she said softly. Adrian did not deny it. "I should have searched much sooner." Victoria offered a gentle smile filled with understanding rather than disappointment. "Then I hope you find more than her location." Adrian looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the palace behind them. "Sometimes we believe we are searching for another person, when in truth we are searching for the version of ourselves we wish we had been." Her words stayed with him long after he rode beyond the palace gates. The journey carried him through villages that had once blurred together during countless royal inspections. This time he traveled slowly. Instead of focusing only on roads, harvests, and treaties, he noticed people. An elderly woman sitting outside a bakery smiled warmly when she recognized the king. "Your Majesty," she called cheerfully. "Please thank Miss Carter the next time you see her." Adrian gently guided his horse closer. "You know Evelyn?" The woman laughed. "Know her? 3 winters ago, she visited this town after a heavy snowstorm. She convinced the palace to send extra blankets before anyone else realized we needed them. She stayed 2 days helping my grandchildren repair the school roof. She said the idea belonged to the royal council, but we all knew whose hands carried the lumber." Adrian thanked the woman quietly before continuing down the road. Less than 5 miles later, he stopped beside a small orchard where children played beneath rows of apple trees. A young teacher recognized him immediately and hurried forward. "Your Majesty, please tell Miss Carter our students still use the books she sent." Adrian felt his chest tighten. "She sent books?" "Every spring," the teacher answered. "She always claimed they came from forgotten palace storage rooms. But one of the merchants later admitted she purchased many herself with her own savings." Adrian looked toward the laughing children chasing one another between the trees. None of them knew Evelyn's name had remained hidden, so someone else could receive the gratitude. By late afternoon, he reached another village nestled beside a gentle river. There he met an elderly carpenter repairing a wooden bridge. The man smiled when Adrian introduced himself, but seemed far more excited by another subject. "Miss Carter visited here only last week," he said proudly. Adrian's heart quickened. "She was here?" "Yes, Your Majesty. She helped organize supplies after the spring floods damaged several cottages upstream. She worked beside everyone else from sunrise until dark." Adrian glanced around the peaceful village. "Where did she go afterward?" The carpenter pointed toward the western hills where rolling meadows disappeared beneath towering pine forests. "She mentioned a place called Willow Creek. Said there were abandoned buildings that could become a small healing center if someone believed they were worth saving." Adrian thanked him sincerely before continuing westward as evening painted the sky with warm shades of amber and rose. Every mile carried another story. Every stranger seemed to know Evelyn not as a palace administrator, but as the woman who remembered lonely people long after others forgot them. She had never spoken about these journeys. She had never listed them among her accomplishments. She had simply gone wherever kindness was needed. As the sun dipped below the mountains, Adrian finally reached a gentle ridge overlooking Willow Creek. Below him rested a quiet valley unlike anything he expected. Children laughed while carrying baskets of wildflowers. Elderly villagers sat together beneath wide oak trees sharing evening tea. A weathered chapel had been transformed into a welcoming community house surrounded by fresh gardens and newly painted fences. Hope seemed to bloom from every corner of the little settlement. Then he saw her. Evelyn knelt beside a little girl helping her plant lavender along a stone pathway. Her simple blue dress carried traces of soil near the hem, and loose strands of chestnut hair danced gently in the evening breeze. She laughed at something the child whispered, and the sound carried faintly across the valley. It was a laugh Adrian had heard only a handful of times in 9 years because he had never stayed still long enough to truly listen. She looked lighter somehow, freer. There was no royal title surrounding her, no endless schedules, no palace corridors demanding another sacrifice. There was only a woman whose quiet kindness had finally found a place where it was returned with open smiles instead of silent expectation. Adrian remained motionless on the ridge, unable to take another step. For the first time in his life, he understood that the greatest distance between two people was never measured in miles. It was measured in all the years one heart had been waiting while the other had never looked closely enough to notice. Adrian Blackwood remained on the hillside until the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Below him, Willow Creek slowly settled into the peaceful rhythm of evening. Children carried empty watering cans back toward the little community house, while elderly neighbors gathered on wide wooden porches, exchanging stories beneath glowing lanterns. Evelyn Carter stayed behind in the garden after everyone else returned indoors. She carefully brushed loose soil from her hands before standing quietly among rows of blooming lavender. There was no urgency in her movements anymore, no endless schedule waiting for her, no palace bell reminding her that another responsibility demanded her attention. For the first time since Adrian had known her, she looked completely at peace. He finally gathered the courage to walk down the winding path. Gravel crunched softly beneath his boots, and Evelyn slowly turned toward the sound. Their eyes met across only a few yards of fading twilight. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence carried 9 years of unspoken moments, countless ordinary days, and an entire lifetime of things that should have been said much sooner. Evelyn was the first to smile. It was gentle, warm, and sincere, just as it had always been. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. Adrian stopped a few steps away. "Please," he answered softly. "Not today." She tilted her head slightly before nodding with understanding. Then, "Adrian." Hearing his name in her voice, without the formality of palace walls, stirred something deep inside him. He had heard thousands of people speak his name over the years. Somehow it had never sounded this honest. He searched her face for signs of anger, disappointment, or resentment. He found none. That somehow made everything even harder. "I have been looking for you," he admitted. Evelyn glanced around the peaceful valley before looking back at him. "You found me. I should have found you long before you left." She remained silent, allowing the evening breeze to fill the space between them. Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. "I read your letter. I hoped you would." I also found your journals. Evelyn's expression softened with quiet surprise. Those were never meant to become a burden. They were never a burden, Adrian replied. They became a mirror. She studied him carefully, noticing the exhaustion beneath his silver eyes and the humility that had quietly replaced the certainty she had always associated with the Alpha King. He looked different, not weaker, simply more human. I did not come here to ask why you left, Adrian continued. I already know the answer. I came because I finally realized how little I truly knew about the person who stood beside me every single day. Evelyn looked toward the small garden where rows of young lavender swayed gently beneath the evening breeze. I never wanted you to feel guilty. That is exactly what makes this so difficult, Adrian whispered. You never asked me for anything. He drew a slow breath before continuing. I thanked generals whose victories depended upon plans you quietly prepared. I praised successful programs without realizing they began as your ideas. I believed comfort simply appeared around me because I never stopped to ask who created it. I believed kindness was effortless because I never noticed the person choosing it every day. Evelyn listened without interrupting. The old version of herself would have cried hearing those words. The woman standing in Willow Creek simply listened with calm understanding. Do you remember, Adrian asked carefully, the western balcony after the anniversary celebration? A faint smile touched her lips. Yes. I walked past you. Yes. I did not even see you. Evelyn answered honestly. No, you did not. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. I have replayed that moment more times than I can count. Another quiet silence settled between them. Somewhere nearby a child laughed before being called inside for dinner. Warm light spilled from cottage windows, wrapping the valley in peaceful gold. Finally Evelyn spoke. You were never cruel, Adrian. He looked up immediately. That almost makes it worse, she continued gently. If you had been cruel, I could have blamed you. Instead, you were simply carrying responsibilities too heavy for one person. You looked at kingdoms, treaties, harvests, and people who depended upon you. I quietly accepted that my own heart would always come last. Adrian's voice became almost a whisper. And I allowed you to accept that. She nodded once. Yes. He stepped forward instinctively before stopping himself. Evelyn, I am sorry. She believed him. She could hear it in every word. The apology carried no pride, no expectation, and no attempt to erase the past with beautiful promises. It was simply true. Thank you, she answered. Adrian looked at the gardens surrounding them. Come back with me. The request hung gently in the evening air. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled toward a little cottage where several children pressed homemade drawings against the windows, laughing together while waiting for supper. Do you know what I discovered after leaving the palace? She asked softly. Adrian shook his head. I discovered that I enjoy waking up without wondering whether anyone will notice if I am tired. I discovered that kindness feels different when people freely return it. I discovered that Evelyn Carter exists even when no one needs another problem solved. Adrian listened carefully, every word settling deep inside him. I am happy here, she continued. Not because I stopped caring about the palace. Not because I stopped caring about you. I am happy because I finally learned how to care about myself. Adrian lowered his head, accepting the truth without argument. Then I will not ask you to give that up. Evelyn looked at him with quiet surprise. But I am asking for something else, he continued. Not forgiveness today. Not another chance because I finally understand what I lost. I am asking for the opportunity to become someone worthy of standing beside the woman I should have appreciated from the beginning. The evening breeze carried the scent of lavender between them. Evelyn smiled gently, but there was new strength within that smile now, the strength of someone who no longer measured her worth by another person's attention. Then do not prove it with words, she said softly. Live differently. See people the way you never learned to see me. Let the kingdom feel the lesson before I ever consider believing it. Adrian nodded without hesitation. I will. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Some distances could not be crossed in a single conversation. But for the first time, they were both standing still, looking at each other clearly, beneath the same quiet evening sky. Autumn arrived quietly across the northern territories, covering the forests surrounding Blackwood Palace with brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Nearly 3 months had passed since Adrian Blackwood rode home from Willow Creek, carrying nothing except a promise he intended to keep. The kingdom noticed the changes long before anyone understood their cause. Council meetings no longer began until every advisor, servant, and messenger had been invited to speak if they possessed useful knowledge. Village inspections lasted longer because the Alpha King now spent as much time listening to farmers, teachers, healers, and stable hands as he did speaking with nobles. Forgotten roads were repaired because ordinary families requested them, not because wealthy merchants demanded them. Every official report now included a section titled, "What have we overlooked?" The question had become Adrian's quiet reminder that the smallest voices often carried the greatest truths. Inside Blackwood Palace, another tradition quietly disappeared. No celebration ended before every servant who helped create it received public thanks. The royal kitchens were renovated after Adrian learned how many years the cooks had worked with worn equipment without complaint. New libraries opened in remote villages after discovering Evelyn had once purchased books there with her own savings. Scholarships were established for young Omegas who wished to become healers, teachers, and administrators because Adrian finally understood that talent had never belonged to rank alone. Whenever anyone praised these changes, Adrian answered with the same words. "We are simply learning to see what should have been seen long ago." He never spoke Evelyn's private story aloud. That belonged to her. But every decision carried the lesson she had left behind. Meanwhile, Willow Creek flourished in ways Evelyn Carter had never imagined. The abandoned chapel became a thriving community center where children learned to read beside retired craftsmen who eagerly shared lifelong skills. Travelers stopped for rest and often stayed an extra day simply because kindness seemed to linger naturally within the valley. Gardens expanded across hillsides that had once stood empty. Every flower blooming there reminded Evelyn that growth rarely happened overnight. It happened through quiet care repeated every single day. One crisp October morning, a royal messenger arrived carrying an elegant invitation sealed with the crest of Blackwood Palace. The annual Moon Harvest Festival would gather every allied pack for the first time since the kingdom's reforms had begun. At the bottom of the invitation, Adrian had written only one personal sentence in his own hand. "I hope you will come as our honored guest, not because the kingdom needs you, but because I would be grateful to see you again." Evelyn folded the letter slowly. There was no pressure hidden inside the words. No expectation, only respect. After thoughtful silence, she accepted the invitation. The festival transformed the palace into a sea of warm lanterns, music, and laughter beneath a clear evening sky filled with brilliant stars. Delegations from every territory wandered through decorated courtyards while children chased glowing paper lanterns across the gardens. Unlike previous celebrations, the palace felt different. Servants laughed openly with visiting guests. Advisors paused to thank workers carrying heavy supplies. The atmosphere no longer revolved around appearances alone. It revolved around people. As Evelyn entered the courtyard, several familiar faces hurried forward with joyful smiles. The head cook embraced her warmly before remembering his manners. The palace librarian proudly showed her newly restored reading room. Young servants she had once mentored excitedly described promotions they had earned through new training programs. No one treated her as invisible anymore. They welcomed her as someone whose kindness had quietly shaped their own lives. Standing near the central fountain, Victoria Ashford approached with genuine warmth. "I have wanted to thank you," she said softly. Evelyn looked surprised. "For what?" Victoria smiled. "Because your courage changed more than one heart." Before Evelyn could answer, the palace bells rang gently across the courtyard. Conversations gradually faded as Adrian stepped onto the broad stone staircase overlooking the festival. He wore simple ceremonial clothing rather than the elaborate robes expected of an Alpha King. After thanking every allied pack for another season of peace, he paused longer than usual. His silver eyes searched the crowd until they found Evelyn standing near the fountain surrounded by lantern light. For one brief moment, the entire celebration seemed to disappear. Then, instead of remaining upon the royal platform, Adrian walked down every single step, separating him from the people gathered below. Murmurs spread gently through the crowd as nobles instinctively moved aside. He continued walking until he stood directly before Evelyn. There were no trumpets, no grand proclamation, Only quiet honesty. Adrian looked into her eyes with the same humility she had first seen in Willow Creek. Then, before the entire kingdom, he lowered himself onto one knee. A stunned silence settled across the courtyard. For many years, Adrian said clearly enough for everyone to hear. I believed leadership meant always standing above others so I could protect them. Someone wiser than I ever realized taught me that true leadership begins by learning to stand beside people instead. His gaze never left Evelyn. I cannot ask for the years I failed to see you. I cannot erase the loneliness you carried while serving this kingdom with extraordinary kindness. But I can promise that because of you, countless others will never feel unseen again. He placed one hand over his heart. Thank you, Evelyn Carter, for changing not only your king, but your kingdom. Tears shimmered in many eyes throughout the courtyard. Evelyn felt her own heart grow wonderfully quiet. Months earlier, those words would have healed every wound she carried. Now they became something even greater. They became proof that love had inspired lasting change instead of temporary regret. She gently offered Adrian her hand. He accepted it, rising to stand beside her rather than above her. The crowd erupted into warm applause, not because a romance had been declared, but because they had witnessed something far rarer. They had watched pride become humility, gratitude become action, and respect become visible before an entire kingdom. Adrian smiled gently. Would you walk with me? Evelyn looked toward the lanterns swaying beneath the autumn sky, then back at the man who had finally learned how to truly see another heart. She smiled with peaceful confidence. Yes, she answered, one step at a time. Together, they walked slowly through the festival, not toward an ending, but toward a future built on something stronger than silent devotion. It was built on two people who had finally learned that the greatest love is never proven by how long someone waits to be noticed. It is proven by what both hearts choose to become once they finally see each other clearly. If this story touched your heart, please take a second to support the channel by hitting the like button and subscribe so you never miss our next Alpha King and Omega journey. Every like helps these stories reach more people who believe that kindness, loyalty, and true love still matter. Now we would love to hear from you. If you were in Evelyn's place, would you have waited for 9 years, or would you have walked away much sooner? And one more question. Do you believe the Alpha King truly earned a second chance, or was his realization simply too late? Share your thoughts in the comments below because your perspective might inspire someone else reading this story. We read as many comments as we can, and your voice is an important part of this community.